When I was invited to give this homily based on the daily office lectionary texts for today, I will admit I was delighted. The daily office gives us the long-form narrative of our scriptures that are simply not practical for use on Sundays, taking on big stories, dramatic themes, and difficult texts. I've got this, I told myself, full of coffee and blessed with a sense of the nearsightedness that comes from being an epiphany when you accept such offers. However, as we entered into Lent and deadline pressure in the midst of all the hectic, wonderful activity loomed on the horizon, my delight gave in to doubt just a bit. Because one of the challenges of visiting a long, complicated story, just as we have tonight in Genesis, is that it's hard to make sure we're all caught up on the story. I will admit personally that in the recent days, I have been a little sluggish on my daily office reading, and so to know where we are in the Joseph cycle is a bit of a challenge. And preparing recently in the days, flipping glumly from Genesis to Romans and pausing with Psalm 34, my interior monologue was, I've got nothing. I've been invited to dinner and I forgot to bring a bottle of wine or even dessert. So here we go. But as the Gospel of Luke, and I don't mean Luke the physician, I mean the cool hand Luke, tells us, the movie, sometimes nothing gives you a real cool hand. So here goes nothing. There is something about the Lenten stories of our church, chronicling our history of Genesis and Exodus, as well as Jesus' temptation in the wilderness, that draws my mind always toward the desert. The desert's a backdrop for these stories of fierce landscapes and desolate places like mountaintops and the desert plains. They're the stories of life out of a landscape that silently screams, I've got nothing, and so have you. It sets up for us not only a physical geography, but a spiritual geography. And the Joseph story truly begins as he is planted in a dry well in the desert by his brothers and later sold into slavery by those brothers out into Egypt. And out of that dry well, out of nothingness, the son of Jacob is born again into slavery in Egypt to rise to power not once, but twice, before confronting his brothers who've long since forgotten about him, as we see in tonight's reading, plucked somewhere from reality TV and something like Judge Judy or Jerry Springer. This moment of tension, of ambush has yet to play itself out. The brothers don't recognize that Joseph is the one that they had so long ago discarded. Joseph is now angling for the exchange and the handing over of their youngest brother, Benjamin. Joseph, dealt a handful of nothing but betrayal and displacement, is the seed that yields the grain that will eventually feed Joseph's starving family, even if it means bringing all of them eventually out of their land and into bondage in Egypt. That's how we get to the Exodus story. It's a story of liberation from bondage, the journey back through that fierce wilderness of a desert landscape. As we heard this morning, God calls Moses through the burning bush to lead the people out of bondage and into liberation, even if it means heading away from the certainty of food, back out into the desert, away from the comforts of a life that was arguably miserable, but at least familiar, the devil that we know. As God calls Moses, as God calls most prophets, their response is one form or another of, I've got nothing. And we know that God provides. Jesus, the new Moses, is sent in the beginning of Lent, conveniently for us, out into the wilderness after his baptism to be tempted, hungry and lonely, in an experience of yielding his own divinity, giving that up so that he might too get a taste of having nothing. Training in a way for that ultimate experience of humiliation and torture, the pain, the abandonment, the hunger and thirst on the cross. In the Lenten journey, it's part of our tradition to do some of that own lightening of the load, some soul searching, to examine ourselves and our relationship with God. We recite the Decalogue in worship. We say the confession, and we essentially pull out the map and compass of our own spiritual geography, trying to take a bearing in what can be a featureless landscape. It's time to embrace that desolation, separating ourselves in some ways from the physical and the spiritual. Our reading from Romans is chock full of language about separating that life of the spirit from the life of the flesh, that the hope of our resurrection comes not from the flesh, because that fails us, but focusing on the transcendent, the immortal, while we as humans tend to focus on the imminent and scarcity. Just a few verses beyond our reading for tonight in Romans, we hear a description of the groaning of all creation for a redemption yet to be revealed. The groaning of all creation for a redemption yet to be revealed. The groaning that comes from a hungry belly or time out in the desert, not knowing where to go, of having nothing. But sometimes nothing gives you a real cool hand. As we join Joseph and Jesus and all of our scriptural heroes in the wilderness, we know that life springs even from, especially from, these places. We might be experiencing our own sense of having nothing, of being weighed in the balance and found wanting, of being spiritually dried up in our relationships with God and with our neighbors here on earth. But we're blessed with a God who provides anyway. One of the gifts of being dropped into the desert without a drop to drink or a Bible or a bite to eat, rather, is that we are liberated from any delusion that we are in control or that everything is okay. We're not. It isn't. But if there's anything we've learned from these exercises in finitude, it's that God is one heck of a poker player and often calls our bluff time and again. Joseph, the rejected brother, planted in a desolate and dry well, ends up feeding the entire nation of Israel. David, the youngest shepherd of Jesse's family, fells a giant and becomes a king. Jesus, the stone that the builders rejected, becomes the cornerstone, enduring the cross and coming back for us who abandoned him anyway. So if you too have found yourself weighed in the balance and found wanting, if you found yourself slacking on a Lenten discipline, if you're behind in the lectionary readings for tonight, if you are packing your bags for an extended trip to Canada during this primary season, if you are eating chocolate when you are not supposed to, fear not. We know that our nothingness is still something that God embraces and that God is capable of a reconciliation and redemption and renewal that we never could imagine. I may have nothing, but sometimes nothing gives you a real cool hand. Thanks be to God.